Hello student, I'm Professor Smita Jha and I'm here to discuss labor, gender and economic in Victorian era. And as we all know that Victorian era is one of the most important of the whole literary corpus. So let us see what is the criteria of labor and then the gender standard and also economy during this period. Gender relations in 19th century Britain have come to be seen in terms of separate spheres ideology, originating in the middle class and percolating to the working class. The male sphere constituted the public world of work, politics, and finance. Women became increasingly associated with the private realm of home and family. Thus, a vital cornerstone of the separate spheres ideology was the ideal of the family wage. A man should be able financially to support his wife and children. Women should not have to learn a living. A married woman should be economically dependent on her husband. And a single woman should be provided for by a male relative. Furthermore, women should not have to deal with financial matters. So, husbands took over the property of their wives at marriage, and wives were increasingly excluded from the running of family businesses. It is generally agreed that while this ideal separation of public and private was often unattainable for the working class, it had considerable effect within the middle class and led to Victorian wives and daughters being more or less confined to domesticity and social and economic dependence on a male relative. In recent years, there have been a number of studies which have revised and modified the notion of women being enclosed in the domestic sphere in the Victorian era. Accounts of working class women's lives have uncovered the extent of their involvement in waged labor and in working class politics, whatever the prevailing ideology. There have also been several modifications to the standard image of the bourgeois woman immured in the home. Studies of middle class women have revealed how many of them battled to enter the public arena, for example, in education, medicine, and politics. Other studies have explored how the highly circumscribed public space allocated to women, such as voluntary work, was negotiated by women to carve out an influence niche, and how, even in local government, women created a space for themselves. It has been suggested that the separate spheres paradigm is not the most useful way to view gender relations and the role of women in the 19th century. However, research on the social history of the middle classes has emphasized the diverse composition of this group and the divergences of wealth, power, and status, as well as the divisions in terms of religious and political identity. These divisions within the middle class may also have been reflected in their cultural and social worlds, making it likely that there was no single woman's culture or sphere. Therefore, there is a need to examine the diversity of experience amongst middle class women and the different roles and positions that they occupied in society. It is necessary to look at the woman role of widows and the spinster as well as that of the archetypal angel in the home wife. It is also the case that the experience of women in the lower middle class differed in some respect from that of the upper bourgeoisie. We may be unwise to talk of the Victorian middle class woman and the restrictions placed upon her by a separate sphere ideology if we can detect different patterns among different groups of women. With the exception of Davidoff and Hall's family fortune, the economic role of middle class women in 19th century Britain has rarely been the subject of detailed empirical research based on unpublished material. Arguably, local area studies and microhistories are particularly useful for our understanding of those whose lives have tended to be viewed through the prism of powerful ideological construct such as separate sphere and domesticity. Whilst the question of typicality will always arise, such studies enable us to move beyond the generalities of the telescopy approach and to attempt to assess the purchase of ideologies upon everyday life. There have been a number of attempts since then to rehabilitate the Victorian census as a source for women's work as a repost. In 1998, John Mackay noted that the published census reports indicated that there was consistently higher employment for married women in 19th century Lancashire than elsewhere and in industrial areas within that country rather than in rural areas, all of which pointed to the usefulness of the source. In 1999, Michael Anderson showed from research based on samples of CEB for Lancashire in 1851 that large numbers of women continued to work in the textile factories after they had married. They only appeared to move out of such employment when they had children and had no one in the household to provide childcare. His conclusion was that the manuscript censuses were a useful source for women's work. This subsequently led Leigh Shaw Taylor to argue that the married work of women in factories was very well recorded, and that it was unlikely that unmarried women's work would be less well enumerated. However, it is perhaps unwise to base statements about all women's work on the basis of Lancashire alone. This is because, as Shaw Taylor himself stresses, the experience of women was very diverse, and any simple aggregate national narrative about women's experience of the labor market during the Industrial Revolution is likely to be seriously misleading. As Nickel Goose has recently summarized the situation, the more informed critics of the census data have concluded that the jury is out of the question of under enumeration of women's employment. Women made a vital contribution to the labor force in Victorian Britain. Census evidence suggests that close to 40% of women in Britain were employed in the second half of the 19th century, which is roughly twice the rate found for the United States at the same time. This implies that the labor market earnings of women made a substantial contribution to the fortunes of many working class households. But how did the industrial economy of mid Victorian Britain treat women who sought work? It is well known that women experienced large scale occupational segregation, with women excluded entirely from many professions and industries. Less well known, however, is how the pay of women evolved after 1850, particularly in relation to their male counterparts. Between 1850 and 1890, women in British industry had earnings a little more than 40% of male earnings in industry. The gender pay gap closed by only a few percentage points over the Victorian period, and it would appear that it is at least as large in the second half of the 19th century as what others have found for the first part of the Industrial Revolution between 1780 and 1850. While part of the explanation for the large pay gap is the exclusion of women from the best paid industries and trades, differences in the composition of employment between men and women can only account for a small fraction of the gender gap. Lack of further information on the same has also been attributed to the Victorian and Edwardian censuses of England and Wales, a problematic source for studying the work of women. Census taking in the period was a predominantly male affair. Census enumerator, who were mainly men, gave to household heads, again mostly male, census household schedules, which they filled up using instructions provided by the exclusively male civil servants of the General Register Office in London. The Victorian enumerators collected the household schedules and copied them into census enumeration book and then dispatched these to the official at the General Register Office. When the latter received the CEBs, they proceeded to abstract the information in them using classification and coding system they had devised to create tables and commentaries to be published in Parliament papers. This, it has been argued, introduced biases against recording the work of a woman at almost every stage. Historians' concern over the recording of women's work in the census have been voiced over a considerable period. In the history workshop journal in 1986, for example, Sonia Rose argued that many historians have shied away from census data because of some very serious shortcomings in the extent to which women's occupations are reflected in the enumerator's record. Homework and casual employment in general are underreported in the censuses. The following year, in their path breaking work, Family Fortune, Leonore Davidoff and Catherine Hall insisted, quote, information on women's occupation where they were not a household head is so unreliable as to be almost useless, and by definition, married women were not considered heads of the household. Similarly, in History Workshop Journal, in Women Work and the Census, a problem from historians of women, Brigitte Hill, while claiming censuses are or should be a way in knowledge of work done by women, asserted that what was common to all censuses was that women's work was consistently underrecorded. In 1995, Sarah Horrell and Jane Humphreys argued in Women's Labor Force Participation and the Transition to the Male Breadwinner Family 1719 to 1865 that although many authors have used 19th century census data to demonstrate declining female participation and increasing employment segregation, the census enumeration of women's employment is demonstrably inaccurate. According to Horrell and Humphreys, the most substantial underreporting was to be found in the case of married women, in the agricultural sector, in manufacturing, and in certain service occupation. Such work, they concluded, was invisible to male observer. The existence of gender bias has been of interest to development economists and historians alike. While unequal treatment of girls is evident in a number of countries today, there is less certainty about whether it existed in the industrializing countries of the past. Evidence for 19th century British households has been mixed. Nationwide, while over 60% of men were able to sign their names in the parish register on marriage in the 19th century, this was true for only 43% of women. But here, the links with women's economic activity and ability to generate resources for the household are opaque and may even be inverted. Female illiteracy was particularly high in the industrial areas, where more women worked for wages. In the Victorian period, that can be called as the era of transition or radical reforms. Victorian society bore witness to major penetrating changes at an unprecedented pace, which affects the social, economic, political, and educational structure profoundly. The most remarkable feature of the age was the feeling of challenge against the traditional institutions, structures, slaving, values, custom, and viewpoint. Industrial revolution was one of the greatest developments that dominates the age with pessimistic or optimistic speculations. It created on its way to make itself accept to the conservative nature of the society at the beginning of the 19th century. It was inevitable that economic progress and industrialization led to population growth in urban life. These included the urbanization of rural areas, the intensification of the growth of towns, the coming of railways, better sanitation, higher living standards, while industrial revolution, however, creates a gap between employers and workmen. These groundbreaking changes naturally traversed the stereotypical gender roles by making women pursue for more social rights and independence in both education and work sphere, and by attacking the patriarchal structure of the society that condemns women to domestic imprisonment. Appearing at the end of the 19th century, the new woman was certainly more active, social, self-confident, and economically independent than the old conventional woman was. In the 19th century, British social and political life also bore witness to some leading movements such as conservatism, liberalism, feminism, and socialism. With the rise industrial revolution and democratization, together with capitalism and rise of the British Empire, these movements found the possibility to appear and develop more freely and easily. They were inseparable from each other, like the rings of a chain because of a cause and effect relationship in which the presence of one stipulated the presence of the other. The Industrial Revolution was one of the most influential and significant events in English political and social thought, which shaped many different ideologies and on the way through democratization. English society and government took a more liberalistic and socialistic stand, which required equality and freedom, both for men and women. Through the late Victorian period, independent, new type women, different from traditional ones, emerged, triggered feminism, and challenged patriarchy and restrictions imposed upon them. Interrelated with each other, these movements were the basis that radically affected the role of the individual in society and the role of government in the Victorian era. In Victorian age, with industrialization, the condition of the working class in England became worse and worse. The factories became filled with lots of people working under very hard, miserable, and unhealthy condition, among whom even incest was spread. Many people lived in one room uncomfortably. They had various diseases caused by malnutrition, exhaustion, and vice. These unhealthy conditions increased the death rate. Life became cheap, both at home and at work. In times, this case led to socialist movement that protected the rights of working people, and then liberalism arose, which defends individual rights in terms of law, religion, freedom, and equality. The spirit of democratization and the dream of a better society and order triggered all these movements, stepping through the 28th century welfare state as a result of the event, such as the New Poor Law, the repeal of the Corn Laws, the cherished movement, Victorian society, especially working class, experienced challenging trials undoubtedly before and after the Industrial Revolution. Although many oppositions or rebellions cropped up during the advent of industrial revolution, which discharged lots of hand workers, it was seen that the industrial revolution provided the working class with better opportunities than before. When evaluated in the long run, the victims of this welfare state and economic progress cannot be denied. But it is a reality that technological advances and industrialization brought drastic changes in the quality of people's lives. The population explosion was one of the remarkable features of the Victorian period, which made its mark as a result of medical, scientific, technological advances and demographic problems. As J.F. Harrison emphasized, the most important thing about population of early Victorian Britain was that it was larger than ever before, and moreover was increasing rapidly still further. Medical and sanitary developments enabled more children to survive and people to live longer. Rising wages and living standard, along with economic growth, triggered the birth rate to increase while they decreased the death rate. High incomes made it possible to reach sufficient means for subsistence and to pay the necessary medication to a struggle with lethal and infectious diseases. On the other hand, it was inevitable that population growth in greater scale brought about many social, economic, and political problems. The fear was that available food supply could not cover the needs of rapidly increasing population. In the long process, this condition posed a risk for the welfare of society, in the opinion of pessimistic economists. Especially the Great Famine of Potato in Ireland in 1901 led to substantial decrease in the large population of Ireland. Although Ireland had 3 times larger population than Scotland in 1841. However, except for Ireland, the population of England, Wales, and Scotland increased in a regular base until 1901, and the population of British Isles reached 41 total. One of the pessimist economists, Thomas Malthus, defended population must always be kept down to the level of the means of subsistence, though his idea was refuted afterwards. He claimed that population, when unchecked, increases in geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. Therefore, rapid population growth was believed to pose a great risk for the future of society as the food supply would not be sufficient. Hartwell points out as the 19th century progressed, however, it became obvious that the immiserating of the working classes, the nightmare of Malthus, and the hope of Marx was not taking place. Instead, there was a slow but gradual improvement in the condition of the masses. There was a great decline in birth rate in the second half of the 19th century. The surplus of money or wealth did not necessarily mean that there would be an absolute increase in the birth rate. Finally, control of family size opened the way to the relative prosperity of the British working class since the 1880s, and this proved that Malthusian fears were unfounded. Meanwhile, for women of the Victorian era, motherhood was the ultimate goal. Society regarded it as the highest achievement, alongside a decent husband and home. To gain the status of angel of the house, a woman didn't need an education. She needed to learn skills such as sewing, cooking, and time management. She also needed to learn social skills so she could meet the neighbors and deal with servants. Most women learned how to be wives and mothers from their own families. Victorians believed deeply in the importance of family and the job of keeping home. And family together was down to the woman because the man was at work all day, also organizing the home, keeping it clean, providing tasty meals, and bringing up children was seen as providing enough emotional fulfillment for women. This definition of gender roles is what developed the ideology known as separate spheres. Men were seen as the physically stronger sex, and so they did either an incredibly physically job such as laboring, or they went into a job where they had to be emotionally strong and resilient. These jobs included banking, running businesses, being a magistrate or a doctor, for example. As the living standards of Victorian people improved, their view of life changed accordingly. Pope indicates that improvement in child survival and changing patterns of work, a desire for better standard of accommodation and general welfare led to the association of family size with the quality of life, encouraging many to restrict fertility within marriage to ensure a more secure future. Especially the fact that from 1875 on, women in the developed world began to have notably fewer children, was the confirmation of redefined and improved life standards of Victorian people by confuting the Malthusian theory that contains economic progress will unconditionally lead to population boom, and this population growth will exceed subsistence level by inviting a disaster in the end. Nonetheless, as K. Theodore Hoppen demonstrates in his book entitled The Mid-Victorian Generation 1846-1886, with rising living standards, there was every reason to suppose that death rates would fall, which indeed they did, and to an unprecedented degree. These demographic changes very clearly show that there were indeed great improvements in the quality of life in Victorian Empire. Poverty and the effects of industrialization on it were another important issue discussed in the Victorian period. There were two opposite sides which either supported or opposed to industrial revolution. Some of them thought that poverty was decreased by industrialization, while some claimed that poverty was much worse after industrial revolution. Even it is claimed that the origin of modern poverty goes back to the act of industrialization. Until the Industrial Revolution, Hartwell says, most men at most time and in most places have lived short and miserable lives with little hope of betterment and no concept of progress. By attracting our attention to very low level of productivity and uneven distribution of products. Hansen also reinforces this idea by saying there has been little or no controversy about the standard of living in the second half of the century because the evidence is so clear that it was rising. In the long run, industrial revolution led to material affluence, but the condition of the first factory worker was miserable. There were many underlying reasons for the revolution. Although the replacement of steam for hand power played a great role in the revolution, the great improvements in the internal and external trade were partly influential as well because the expansion of internal trade was the effect of unparalleled improvements in the means of communication. The establishment of the canal system, the construction of new roads by Telford, and the introduction of railways, as Arnold Toynbee puts it. Many people were made redundant because of the efficiency of machines by creating conflicts between employers and employees. However, on other side, there was still a need for people to work. The machines and most of the work in the factories was based on physical power. Because of the unpopularity of agriculture, because of urbanization, many emigrated from rural sites to towns and cities in which they had better job opportunity. However, the abuse of people's labor for low wages caused the proletariat. Working class were forced to work as if they were like machines. According to Engel's vision, quote, the technical invention of the Industrial Revolution had created the proletariat. Its factory hands were the eldest children of the Industrial Revolution, forming the nucleus of the workers' movement. Unquote. The search for wealth by capitalist employers, by ignoring the emotions and needs of their workmen, but pursuing for cheap labor, destroyed all former intimacies and solidarity between them. In the pre revolution period, when masters and workmen lived together and loved each other, there was an expansion in the wealth of the country. But the problem was that people had little share in this wealth produced. And this naturally caused poverty and misery among them. As three reasons for this destitution and depravity among the working class, Arnold Toynbee puts forward. First, the old poor law, which stimulated increase among a degraded population, and the corn laws, which made bread dear and difficult to get. Secondly, the exhausting conditions of the new industrial methods. Thirdly, the fact that many workmen were fighting with machinery for a miserable subsistence. These oppressive working and living conditions induced people to look for more rights, freedom, and independence. The miserable condition of working class required the reforms such as the abolition of combination laws, the Reform Bill, the Great Factory Act, the New Poor Law, the repeal of the Corn Laws, trades union legislation, the abolition of law of conspiracy, and the Chartist movement. These also thus led to economic changes in the empire. With this, I conclude the discussion, and I hope you must have gathered some opinion for the labor and the economic and the gender class of Victorian society. Let us meet in another lecture with a new topic. Till then, thank you. Bye.